A major pushback is building now in Texas after the Department of Justice decided to block a new voter ID law there. The law would require voters to show a photo ID before entering the polls. The feds say that law is unfair to minorities, to Hispanics in particular. Supporters say it would cut down on fraud and point out you need a voter ID, you need an ID to do things as simple as buying a pack of beer. Joining me now to discuss it, Fox News legal analyst Peter Johnson Jr., who's former chairman of the New York State Commission on Election Modernization, and Bartle Bull, famed civil rights attorney and former New York campaign manager for Robert Kennedy. This is so interesting to me because the Justice Department is doing this systematically. The Supreme Court has already upheld voter ID laws in Indiana, and yet the DOJ has already gone after South Carolina and now Texas, saying you can't have them. You may be fine in Indiana, you not so much. Let me start with you on this, Mr. Bull. What do you make of the tactic that the DOJ is pursuing, and are they onto something legitimate, that we need to protect the rights of minorities at the polls?
No. This is part of the systematic effort by Eric Holder to use his agency, his Department of Government, as an instrument in politics in the next election. And it started in the last election when, of course, after that, he defended the new Black Panther Party for its voter intimidation. And what they really were doing there, that was actually about intimidating poll watchers. And these identification cards are another form of poll watching. They are a verification that the person who's voting should be voting. That was an intent of the Voting Rights Act, of course. And by striking aside, first by intimidating poll watchers, and now by making it almost impossible to determine whether somebody is or is not entitled to vote, they're really trying to maximize what they perceive to be the future electorate of President Obama.
Because these groups, these voting blocs, tend to vote Democratic.
Yes.
And so that's been the charge, that they are trying to
2 or 3 to 1
to increase their voting share at the polls. But they do raise issues about access to the polls, access to the ability to get photo IDs by these voting blocs, and it is the Department of Justice's responsibility to protect.
The Department of Justice should protect the rights of minority voters, but they should also protect the rights of all voters to have access to the polls. And so what we see here in the state of Texas is they came up with these kind of strange numbers. Based on the numbers that the Justice Department saw, 6.3% of Hispanic voters don't have some form of ID that's acceptable to Texas. 4.3% of non-Hispanic voters don't have that ID. So we're talking about a 2% gap. And so now it's been published now, this is a horrible thing. It's terribly inequitable. We're going to be suppressing Hispanic American voters. This is wrong. This is a civil rights issue. Well, it's become a political football is what it's become. So protect minority voters. Protect them from real suppression efforts that have taken place over history. But certainly Texas's effort and the effort in Wisconsin, in South Carolina, in Indiana, as you point out, upheld by the Supreme Court, that's not voter suppression.
But Bartle, it's interesting to me to hear you on this side, because you are somebody who's devoted large portions of your life to fighting for the rights of minorities, in particular at the polls. Don't you see that there is an effort by some, I'm not saying by all, but by some, to suppress that vote? The same way the Democrats want to make sure those voters get out, even if they don't have all the right paperwork, sometimes the Republicans want to make sure they don't get out because they don't think they're going to be pulling the lever for the GOP.
I think this is a legitimate step, photo IDs. By the way, I believe that Eric Holder is the worst attorney general since John Mitchell, who, as you know, was Richard Nixon's attorney general. And that's a serious matter for me. But by the way, right now I'm working in a campaign in Harlem for a young African-American Democrat who's running against Charlie Rangel. And I think he's going to find some problems up there.
Why are you so against Eric Holder? I mean, this is what the Attorney General's job is, right? To go after, watch elections, make sure there's fairness.
He's not doing that. When he protected the new Black Panther Party after their abuses in the last election, he was guaranteeing their right in future elections to intimidate voters and poll watchers. That is the exact opposite purpose. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, did not die to have people carrying weapons blocking the doors to polling places, and those are the people Holder specifically protected.
But of course, that's a wholly separate issue from this. It has nothing to do at all with this. And of course, protecting minority voters is important. And I've seen suppression of minority voters here in New York.
And they always point out, the DOJ always points out there's virtually no evidence of voter fraud, while the GOP uses that to justify.
Well, Texas has pointed out that there were 50 prosecutions and convictions of voter fraud in the state of Texas in the 10 years before. Voter fraud is a problem.
50 in 10 years?
A lot of local prosecutors are afraid to prosecute it They're afraid to prosecute it. They don't want to prosecute it. Of course, it's a problem in America. Of course, it's a problem in many of the states. And to say, well, I need ID to cash a check, to go to the supermarket, to get on an airplane, but I don't need voter ID to vote? That, I think, is strange. A constitutional right should be protected because it is so important. And there should be a higher obligation and a burden to prove who you are and that you have the right to vote. The access should be protected for all Americans, and not only in an election year under some guys, a minority, disenfranchise them. I don't believe it. I think it's a scam. I think the numbers are all crazy, and it's an artifice.
Well, we will wait because this battle's not
Agree.
over. Texas doesn't appear to be, taking it lying down.
You're
Thank you,
going to
gentlemen.
court.
Thank you both so
Pleasure.
much.
Good to see you.
Coming up.